Hello, everyone. Welcome to Jesus College in the University of Cambridge. My name is Nick Guyett. I'm a reader in the history faculty here at Cambridge, and I'm also a fellow of Jesus. And these are strange times. It's tremendously exciting to be here in a totally empty but very beautiful Frankopan Hall. Those of you that know Jesus College may have been here before. You'll know how lovely it is. It is surreal right now to be giving a talk in an empty hall. But before I start, I want to thank the staff here at Jesus College and actually the staff around the university who've been doing such an amazing job in the past few months. Academics like me, cowering in our sheds or our bedrooms at home or in our offices or wherever else, working from home, really have gotten the easier part of the deal. Those people who've been keeping the college going, who've been out every day, the porters, the cleaners, the dining staff, they've just been incredible. And as the students begin to come back right now, with term due to start in about 10 days' time, those people are particularly in my thoughts. And I'm incredibly grateful to them. Okay, today I'm going to talk a bit about my new book. The book is not out for a year, so I hope that it's not going to seem like too much of a naked plug for the book. The book is called The Hated Cage. I'm not sure I'm going to explain that title in the talk, but I might in the question and answer period if you like. And on that front, you're watching this on YouTube, I think. It's probably the only way to watch this. Please do ask questions. So we have the comments feature switched on right now. So if you want to put something in the comments, I mean, this is going to be weird as well. At the end of the talk, I'm going to stop. No one's going to applaud because there's no one here. Some of you are going to leave. You may leave before the end of the talk. And then I'm going to look at the question thread and sort of see if there's anything there in the comments that I can answer. So any questions you have at all, please do put them there. I may not look at them during the talk, but we will be looking at them at the end of the talk. And if no one asks any questions, as soon as the talk is over, we can all get out of here. So whatever works for you works for me. Okay, let me get started. Frank Palmer may not have been the worst sailor in the War of 1812, but he came to think of himself as the unluckiest. Frank was born in 1793 in Stonington, in Connecticut, to a family of comfortable means. Now, unlike many boys who grew up in a region, Frank didn't have a dad or an uncle who had gone to sea, but he loved to read. And when he was a young boy, he became hooked on stories of the sea, stories about brave captains, faraway lands, exotic adventures. He was 18, Frank Palmer, when the United States declared war on Britain in the summer of 1812. And initially, even though he was young, he was very nervous about joining the fight. It was one thing to sail the oceans in search of adventure, but it was another to serve on a ship during wartime and risk getting your head blown off. But the following year, so in 1813, soon after he turned 20, Frank traveled to Newport in Rhode Island to join the crew of a privateer. A privateer was a privately owned vessel which was fitted out with guns and licensed by the American government to prey on British commercial shipping. And I'll say a bit more about privateers in a minute. Now, like many teenagers, Frank was impetuous. And as soon as he signed up for this journey, this voyage on the privateer, he began to doubt his decision. This was not the ship, but this is a replica recently built of the kind of ship that he was on. His ship was called the Roller, and it suddenly seemed small and kind of scrappy to him after he'd signed on. He wondered how it would fare if it ran into one of the Royal Navy's terrifying ships of the line with their 100 or more guns and their 1,000 crew. His boat, by comparison, was pretty tiny. And he kept a journal, which is very important for our story. Palmer wrote in his journal before he left, before he shipped out, "Had I not gone so far, I believe I should return home, as I dislike this privateer very much." But he traveled with his friends. They'd come about 45 miles. He'd signed a document, so he decided he would just go for it and see what happened. He buried his worries, and on the morning of the 10th of December, 1813, he put to sea. But before the Roller even reached the open ocean, it ran into a British warship. Again, this is another privateer being attacked by another British warship, but you get the picture. Heavily outgunned, the captain of the roller surrendered, and after about 22 hours on the ship, Palmer's career as a privateersman came to an end. Back to his journal. "Oh God, what reflections this sad night," he wrote after he was forced into the hold of the British ship. He'd spent less than a day on the roller, but what he didn't know yet was that he would spend the next 545 days in British custody. Frank's odyssey as a prisoner of war would take him from the British hulks at Bermuda, which is where he was taken first of all, to the wooden jail on Melville Island in Halifax, in Canada, to the most terrifying prison in the world. And that prison was Dartmoor, on the cold and foggy uplands of southwestern England. Now, Frank Palmer was one of more than 6,500 American prisoners of war who ended up in Dartmoor. And 5,500 of those were still stuck in the prison in the spring of 1815, months after the War of 1812 had ended. Then, on the evening of 6th of April 1815, Dartmoor's desperate prisoners clashed with their guards, who became convinced the Americans were trying to escape, and the guards opened fire. 9 Americans were killed, dozens were badly injured. Now, that night, the 6th of April 1815, Frank took to his journal again by candlelight, and he wrote this: "The blood of the murdered will ever stimulate us to vengeance. We cry for vengeance." He capitalized that last bit, so I can do it hammily. Okay, so in my new book, I've tried to explain not only why the massacre happened, but why so many Americans ended up in Dartmoor in the first place, and also why the United States government ultimately failed the massacre's many victims. Now, it's an odd twist of fate that I wrote most of this book during lockdown, in a period from March to around June of this year. And I have to say, it was a very strange time to be writing about a group of people who were indefinitely detained and who were rapidly losing faith in their government's ability to save them. The experience of the Americans at Dartmoor gripped me partly because it's a story about how nation states and governments can make huge demands on ordinary people, but without necessarily protecting them when they fall into harm's way. So today, I want to give you an idea of what happened. I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm trying to sort of smoosh this gigantic book into 40 or 50 minutes. So I'm going to skip over a lot of stuff. Again, please do ask questions if there are things that come up that aren't clear or you're just curious about. I promise I'll leave some time to go through those questions at the end of the talks, and I will be cutting a lot of corners. So I'll rely on your questions to keep me honest. Okay, well, let's start with the story of how ordinary sailors would end up playing such a prominent role in the War of 1812. Just to remind you, Frank Palmer was not a naval sailor. He was not in the army or the militia. He was an ordinary citizen who became a privateersman. So let's track back a second and think first of all about how the war happened. The war had several causes, but a major one was the refusal of the British to respect the neutrality of American shipping. Now that sounds incredibly boring and niche for like the cause of a major war, but let me try and explain why it's sort of actually really important and central. We sometimes forget, those of us who do American history, that the first quarter century or so after the federal constitution is ratified in 1788, that first 25 years of the kind of federal era of the US, the modern republic, if you like, coincides with revolution, instability, and relentless warfare in Europe. So it's actually a kind of exceptional time beyond North America when the United States sort of gets its bearings. Now, these guys, Thomas Jefferson on the left and James Madison on the right, who occupied the White House from 1801 to 1817, so they won those 4 elections between them. They wanted the US to move into this vacuum, especially the kind of commercial vacuum that had been created by the endless fighting in Europe. Here was the theory. American ships would trade with the different warring nations in Europe. They might even carry goods between those warring nations as kind of neutral ships and those warring nations' colonies. The combination of European instability and American neutrality would then serve as a kind of anchor for American development, you know, when the state was brand new. Lots of people thought the US might fall apart. So actually, this idea of benefiting from the chaos in Europe through this neutrality and all of this commerce became incredibly attractive to Jefferson and Madison. Now, Britain and France were more ambivalent about this arrangement for some obvious reasons. Each one of them resented the United States for trading with the other nation, so its kind of enemy, and they imposed various restrictions and penalties on American commerce. So Britain and France were both looking kind of jealously when American ships traded with their enemy and wondering whether or not they could restrict the United States' commerce just so they could direct it all to their own nation. So they weren't completely happy with this neutrality arrangement. And Britain had another trick up its sleeve. The Royal Navy was desperate for men, always desperate for men, but particularly during a war. Not least because one of the core strategies of the British during the Napoleonic Wars was to kind of try and keep the French Navy and French shipping in the ports. So a big blockade of France's ports was a major British strategy for winning the Napoleonic War. And if you wanted to do that, you had to have hundreds of warships in the Royal Navy. You also needed tens of thousands of men, more than 100,000 men. So vast, vast numbers of people were required. So Britain, the Royal Navy, routinely stopped American vessels, those neutral vessels as the Americans wanted them to be thought of, all around the Atlantic and actually in other parts of the world as well. They would stop them and they would demand to know if there were any British subjects among the crew. And if there were, they would drag those British suspects off the American vessels and put them in the Royal Navy. Now, as it turned out, there were lots of British subjects on American vessels, but here's where it gets kind of tricky. There were thousands of sailors on American ships who had been born in Britain or Ireland, but many of them had been working out of American ports for many years, may even have seen themselves at that point as American. They may even have been naturalized Americans, so they'd spent long enough to become American citizens. The British also grabbed a bunch of people who were plainly born in the United States and claimed they were British or Irish or whatever else. So the Brits weren't always playing by the rules, but even when they were playing by the rules, to pick someone up who was born in Britain, who'd been living in America for 10 years, they'd stop being British. The British had a vision of citizenship, or rather subjecthood, as something that stayed with you forever. You were always a subject of the king. In the American vision, if you chose to come to the United States, you could elect to be a US citizen if you put the time in to naturalize. So again, there are kind of conflicting visions here of what it means to be a subject and a citizen, and the idea of whether you could choose not to be British. So all that is playing into this too. And I think this brings us to an important fact about sailors, which is that their professional lives required them to move between different nations and continents, but also sometimes to shift their allegiances. Most American sailors would expect at some time in their lives, their professional lives, to sail under the flag of a different nation in terms of the commercial ship that they were working on. Then, as now, the sea was in many ways a truly international space. It was also a place where sailors could escape from some of the constraints of life on shore. British and Irish sailors, for example, would flock to these American merchant ships for better wages, and also in the hope that they could get protected from the British press gang. So there was a kind of strategy for some British and Irish sailors of trying to get a berth on an American ship and work there, precisely to avoid some of the burdens that came with being a British sailor during a time of kind of epic and endless warfare. But also black sailors saw the sea as an escape route from slavery, or from prejudice they might meet on shore. And this is a good moment for me to tell you that of those 6,500 Americans who wound up at Dartmoor, around 1,000 were sailors of color. Now, most told the British that they were born in the United States when they were checked into Dartmoor, but many came from the Caribbean, from South America, from further afield as well. Now, we'll come back to Dartmoor's black prisoners later. I'm going to tell you a bit about them today, but they're a much bigger part of the story I'm telling in my book. Anyway, for now, I just want to emphasize that these American merchant ships are very diverse places, and that sailors on American ships didn't necessarily and always identify very strongly with the United States. So I just want to give you this idea of the sea as a place where national ties and affinities can be kind of a bit diluted, if you'll pardon the terrible pun. But during a war, of course, suddenly which nation you're from, which nation you represent, which nation's flag is flying over your boat, becomes the only thing about you that's relevant. So there's this kind of clash or this tension between the sea as a place where you can escape from nations and a wartime sea as a place where suddenly you're tied into those nations, where you kind of can't escape from whatever that flag you're sailing under says you are. Okay, so why did all of these private sailors end up fighting for the US in the War of 1812? Or to put it a different way, why didn't Jefferson and Madison just front up for a navy? Why not just spend the money to build one? Well, Jefferson and Madison actually firmly believed that a US Navy that was anything like the Royal Navy would be a really bad idea. Partly because the Royal Navy was terrifyingly huge, they didn't think they could afford it, but also because they thought a kind of small navy would still get smashed by the Royal Navy. So why bother having a navy at all of any size, beyond 4 or 5 or 6 large ships, nothing like the 120 or 130 that the Brits had. So they concluded then that American warships wouldn't make a huge difference, even if they had a dozen or two. So instead of pouring resources into a navy, they licensed private ship owners and captains to become privateers. So what would happen is you get a certificate like this one that you can see now, where the President of the United States would effectively authorize the owner or the captain of a ship to go off and be, in effect, a state-sponsored pirate for the duration of the war. You would go off with one of these and you could attack the enemy's shipping, private shipping. You'd usually try and avoid the warships. So if you see the Royal Navy, you get the hell out of there. But if you can find a smaller ship, or any ship that's British that's carrying goods and cargo, you take it on. That's the plan. Now, I think what's so interesting about this strategy is that Thomas Jefferson in particular had a really low view of privateersmen, of the sailors and the captains who were aboard these vessels. He wrote about people like Frank Palmer, quote, "They will cheat us enormously, but no matter. They will make British merchants feel and squeal and cry out for peace." So it's a kind of guerrilla strategy almost to try and put all of your eggs in these privateer baskets, buzzing around trying to destroy British commerce while everyone is avoiding the Royal Navy warships. The United States then was asking more than 100,000 private sailors to take the fight to the British with low expectations of those sailors' loyalty to the Republic, but high expectations that those sailors would be motivated by financial gain. The idea being when they seize British ships, the ships can be sailed back to American ports, they'll be sold, the cargo will be sold, and the proceeds will be given partly to the sailors, captains, and owners of those privateers. So in a sense, Jefferson is thinking about these guys as lowlifes, or at least as people whose kind of loyalty to the nation is not proven, but he thinks they're motivated by money. So in some respects then, Jefferson and Madison both see privateers and privateersmen as mercenaries. But it is worth noting, I think, that the people who volunteered, like Frank Palmer, didn't always feel that they had much choice in the matter. Now, when the War of 1812 began, the economy on shore was completely disrupted. So it was very hard to find a job on shore. But if you wanted to go off and carry on being a sailor, even if you didn't want to be a privateer, you didn't want to get one of these certificates and go off and kind of hunt for your nation, you'd still need guns on your ship. Because you could expect British privateers would come and attack your ship. So actually, in a time of war, it was very hard to carry on being a sailor and not become de facto a privateersman. And there were some ships that went out that weren't kind of officially, at least, saying they were going to try and capture British shipping, but they ended up being in the same kind of space with the same kinds of threats and the same incentive. So actually, I think if you wanted to be a sailor, it was really hard not to be a privateersman. And if you wanted to do something else, it was a tough time to find a job. So I think maybe Jefferson's idea that these guys are sort of completely up for the fight, willing mercenaries, was misplaced. So that explains why sailors like Frank Palmer were doing what they did and why they eventually fell into the hands of the British and were brought to Dartmoor. And very large numbers did. So we're talking about tens of thousands of Americans who fall into the hands of the British during the war, the vast majority of them privateersmen. But what about Dartmoor itself? That's kind of the subject of my book, and I said nothing about it. Why did the British build a gigantic prison in the middle of nowhere? Okay, well, Dartmoor was a product of the Napoleonic Wars. And again, to talk about something that we American historians are often really deficient in. Most American historians don't think too much about the Napoleonic Wars, which is a shame Because, as I said, in some ways, I think the US would not be the nation it became without the Napoleonic Wars. So the Napoleonic Wars are kind of crucial to understanding the backdrop to how the US developed during its early years. So we also sometimes forget, as American historians, that from the British perspective, the War of 1812 between Britain and the US, it's kind of a sideshow. I'm sorry to say that, American viewers, but it is kind of a sideshow because the bigger fight here is between Britain and France. That's the fight that's been going on since the early 1790s. That's the fight that went on the decade before and the decade before that stretched throughout the 18th century, this kind of epic, endless, existential struggle between Britain and France. So sure, the US with the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, it's an irritant. And losing the 13 colonies is a huge deal for Britain. I don't want to minimize that. But the crucial fight is the fight with France. And I should say, too, this isn't just a fight in Europe. This is also a fight for the empires that France and Britain have built around the world. It's a fight that's about slavery and subjugation and economic exploitation far beyond Europe, not just there. So don't necessarily think that the Napoleonic Wars mean European wars. These are world wars waged by European powers. So Dartmoor, this incredible prison, emerged from that struggle with France, and especially from the huge number of prisoners who were captured by Britain during its endless war with Napoleon. But okay, let's ask a really obvious question. If you're going to build a facility for prisoners of war, why would you build it out of granite? I mean, it seems kind of crazy, right? Why not build a temporary facility, and then when the war is over, you can just take it down? Well, there are a bunch of reasons that this building ended up being built out of granite. But one of them was the fact that timber was actually in really short supply by the middle of the 1800s, whereas there was so much granite on Dartmoor, more than enough to build a terrifying Gothic prison. But if you want one single reason why this unlikely edifice came into being, it's the obsession of this guy, Thomas Tyrwhitt, the MP for Plymouth. I say a lot about Tyrwhitt in the book. He's a fascinating guy, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to have to blaze through here. Tyrwhitt became convinced by many philosophers of this kind of moment and many thinkers of the late 18th, early 19th century that a prison would be a really good way to enliven and kind of recover and improve Dartmoor. So as the local MP and as a man who had a house, actually very close to the prison, he wanted something on Dartmoor that would stimulate the economy of the area. And his view was that if you built something there, it could be a prison or a hospital or an orphanage or a school or a house for fallen women or, anything, then eventually the whole region would start to bloom. You'd get agriculture, you'd get small towns growing up, you'd get life. Rather than the kind of bleak and barren fog and mud and peat and everything else that he was less fond of. Now, he got this idea about improvement of Dartmoor, and the idea prison might serve as an engine of improvement from this guy. The fact that UCL, University College London, still have Jeremy Bentham in a box in 2020 does seem to me to be problematic. Anyway, I'm not going to say too much about Bentham. If you want to ask some questions about him and prisons, he's a really interesting figure in terms of thinking of the development of Dartmoor. He was not directly involved, but his ideas and his sort of theories and proposals were certainly part of the picture. So we've got the lack of timber, meaning you've got a big stone prison. We've got Thomas Tyrwhitt, the MP for Plymouth, being the kind of booster of this. We've got Bentham before he was mummified and placed in a glass box in a dining area in UCL, providing some intellectual fuel here. But also we have this guy on the right, Tyrwhitt's old Oxford College friend, George, the actual Prince of Wales. So again, you guys know this, you're alums, you make friends when you're at college that are helpful to you. If one of the people at college with you, it's Christ Church in Oxford, is the Prince of Wales. Actually, it wasn't that he was at Christ Church, it was that one of the senior figures at Christ Church was friendly with George and introduced him to Tyrwhitt. But Tyrwhitt basically went on to be a kind of factotum for the Prince of Wales in the 1780s and 1790s. So the two came to know each other very well. And George got kind of sucked into endorsing all these improvement schemes. Now, the arm of the British government, which ran the war prison system, was called the Transport Board. It was usually both frugal and very sensible. But Tyrwhitt's friendship with George, the future George IV, persuaded the Transport Board that, yeah, maybe it was a good idea to build a giant prison on Dartmoor. Yeah, George thinks it's a good idea. Yeah, perhaps you're right. Despite the fact that there were obvious red flags with the scheme, it did end up being approved by the board. Now, there was one good reason to go ahead with this plan, and that reason is geographical. You can see here, HMP Dartmoor, put my mouse around it if you can see that. So that's where the prison is. Now, if you go down from HMP Dartmoor, less than 20 miles, you can see the port of Plymouth. Plymouth was one of the major ports of the Royal Navy during this period. It was also a place where lots of prisoners would be brought from other places. So it was kind of a good idea to have a prison that was just a day's walk away from the port. There were also a bunch of prison hulks, so these kind of old warships that had been kind of carved out to put prisoners in. There were a bunch of those in Plymouth too. So the thought was, if we could build a prison nearby, we can empty the hulks and create slightly more humane conditions. So let's say that that's a good reason to build a prison. Let's talk about some bad reasons to build Dartmoor where it was. One bad reason is the weather on Dartmoor was often terrible, which meant that the prisoners would be cooped up in their blocks for much of the year. And again, in a kind of eerie and unpleasant echo of our prison, the worry was that if they were cooped up in these blocks, particularly over the winter, that viruses, not that they understood them that well, but that they would spread and that more of the inmates might get sick and might die. So one problem with the weather is that people have to spend more time indoors, which is not good for their health. There was also the fact that the chosen location was actually still remote, so it was a whole day's walk from Plymouth, but there were no real villages or towns close by that could supply it. So the remoteness was a problem. But also, of course, when the wars with France ended, it would be very, very difficult to find another use for the building. Again, we can get back to that maybe if you want to ask in the Q&A, but it is still a prison, although maybe not for too much longer. Okay, so construction began in the winter of 1805, again with the future George IV effectively making sure that this plan was approved. Everything took longer than expected, and the prison only received its first inmates in May of 1809. 3,000 French prisoners streamed northwards from Plymouth in the prison's first week, and by the end of that summer of 1809, there were more than 6,000 prisoners in residence. After the prison was expanded in 1811, it held more than 8,000 men. And I should say here, I'm going to show you a number of different images of Dartmoor. Those of you who are quite sharp-eyed will notice that in some of these images, you can see here, I'm sorry, I should have made my pointer red. You can see here that these are the prison blocks, that there are 5 prison blocks. This is where the prisoners lived. You'll see in some of the later images that there are actually 7 prison blocks. And the prison is greatly expanded by the addition of 2 new prison blocks, which are kind of squeezed in 1811, 1812. So that's the reason that you might see these images looking different. But anyway, the prisoners, they're in these blocks. So these are the blocks where they actually live. Okay, so when the War of 1812 began, the summer of 1812, Dartmoor was still so crammed with Frenchmen that there was no room for American POWs. People like Frank Palmer were taken to the Caribbean or Canada, or they were held in other bits of Britain's global prison network, which actually was crazy. It ran from Barbados to Cape Town to Calcutta. It was truly global, this kind of detention facility complex that Britain had. Now, in the Napoleonic era, here was the plan. Nations were supposed to arrange regular exchanges of prisoners. So when you got a bunch of prisoners and your enemy got a bunch of prisoners, you would correspond with each other and figure out a way to swap them, usually with the prisoners agreeing not to serve again in the war. But here was the problem. Britain, because of the might of the Royal Navy, tended to capture more American and French prisoners than vice versa. So prisoners would be kind of piling up on the British side. There'd be all of these Frenchmen or Spaniards or Americans or whatever. They'd be there in huge, huge, huge numbers. But the enemies of Britain would not be taking anywhere near as many British sailors. So there was this kind of imbalance. And that meant that these prisoner exchanges were not regular. They were sporadic, and actually it was pretty hard to get exchanged for many of these prisoners. So rather than, as the French might have expected, if they were captured in, say, 1804, that they would expect not to be in a prison for much longer than a year, actually a bunch of people captured in 1804 find their way into Dartmoor in 1809, so they were held in other prisons for 5 years, and they were still there in 1814. So we're dealing here with prisoners who spent 10 years as prisoners of war, partly because this exchange system often didn't work. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. But there were some exchanges. There were also prisoners moved from prison to prison. So by the spring of 1813, there was finally enough room for 250 American prisoners to come north to Dartmoor. Now, on the march up from Plymouth, one of those American prisoners looked around and saw the countryside and wrote this. He said that this was the devil's land, inhabited by ghosts and sundry imaginary beings. Rabbits cannot live here, birds fly from it. But then, to make things worse, that prisoner saw the massive stone prison come into view, and he just gave up all hope. Death itself, with the hopes of a hereafter, seemed less terrible, he wrote. Okay, so that's what he'd have seen when he arrived. The prisoners came into Dartmoor through these stone gates. Beneath the words, which you can just about see up here on the first one, parcere subjectis, apologies for mangling that, classicists, a line from Virgil's Aeneid, which means spare the vanquished. Although the Americans might as well have been passing under Dante's motto at the entrance of hell, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. Right, for the first year of their captivity, the Americans at Dartmoor were a tiny minority in a French prison. So everyone else in the prison was a French captive. The Americans were forced to live here in this building in the middle. Put my cursor here. So this prison block here, as you can see, it's confusing. Originally it was called Prison 6, but I'm going to call it Prison 4 because that's what everyone knew it as once the prison was made bigger. So they lived there in that central prison, Prison 4. And they were forced to live on the top floor. See if I got a picture of this. This is a photo taken in the 1990s. Bizarrely, that prison block is still part of modern Dartmoor, even though it's been massively adapted. I think they put a cinema in there, which is ironic. This is the top floor where the Americans were put originally. And if you think about 250 of them, and they shared this with the French, it was pretty cramped. Now, what they'd be forced to do here is sleep on hammocks rather than in cells, which would be kind of hung between the stanchions that would run through the center of the prison floor. So imagine all these stanchions with hammocks slung between them at night. And then again, when everyone wakes up in the morning, the hammocks get taken down and people move around. Now, it was only in April of 1814 when Napoleon finally surrendered. History geeks will know it was the first time he surrendered. He'd be back. But anyway, in April of 1814, Napoleon surrendered. He was sent into exile on the island of Elba. And it was at that point that French prisoners finally started to leave Dartmoor, which had a huge significance for the Americans. It meant that they would have the prison to themselves. This is what the prison looked like then in 1814. You can see the addition of new prison blocks squeezed in on each side here. So there's one over here and there's one over here on the left and the right. They've fitted in an entire new prison block. But again, it's become way more cramped because of that. Anyway, so it's now the summer of 1814. The French have been released. The Americans have the prison to themselves. But at that point, there were only about 1,000 Americans who had come to Dartmoor, and some of those had been exchanged. They'd already been released. So here's what happened. The British then decided to bring all of their American prisoners from around the world to Dartmoor. So in the 6 months from June of 1814 to December of 1814, another 5,000 or so Americans were brought to the prison. Now, who were these guys? Well, here's the funny thing. You know how we Brits love bureaucracy. We love paperwork. Well, Dartmoor is a testament to that in part because we know something about every single prisoner that came to Dartmoor, because when they came in, they were booked into this incredible document. Again, I'm worried I'm coming across as a bit nerdy. It is an incredible document. It's called the Register, and here's what it looked like. So this general entry book of American prisoners of war was a way for the authorities at Dartmoor to record things about every prisoner. What they were called, the ship they'd come in on, what they looked like, how tall they were, how old they were, whether they had distinguishing features. This would also get annotated if they did stuff like tried to escape or tried to kill each other or threw something at a guard. So actually it's this kind of amazing, crazy living record of the prison. Anyway, I'm not doing a good job of claiming not to be a nerd, because one of the things I did at the start of this book is I just created a copy of this. So I started transferring it to a gigantic spreadsheet. Well, it was a small spreadsheet to start with, but it became gigantic because there are 6,550 lines for all of the Americans who were in the prison. Now, the Register tells us all kinds of stories. And again, if you have questions, throw them at me and I can say more about this. I could bore myself on this subject because there's so much to say about it. It tells all kinds of stories. It also helps us, and this is a crucial part, to corroborate or sometimes to disprove the stories that Americans and other people at Dartmoor told about the prison later on. So the great thing about the Register is if somebody who was a prisoner 30 years later wrote about Dartmoor, you can use the Register to figure out whether or not they're forgetting or maybe distorting or maybe flat out lying about something. So that's one of the things I've done a lot in the book. And again, I mentioned earlier that 1,000 of the 6,500 prisoners were people of color. I can find that out from the Register because it may be quite hard to see on the screen, but if you look carefully, one of these columns actually says their visage and complexion. And that becomes a column in which the clerks at Dartmoor will write racial terms. So they'll say someone is black or a Negro or a mulatto, or they'll use the term there. So again, you can, if you transcribe this thing, pull out all of those names of the 1,000 or so black people who end up being coded as black in that column. This is quite unusual for the time, so it's fascinating to have this massive database that's keyed into race. Now, I mentioned before that black people were a commonplace in American crews. They included African Americans, so black people born in the United States, but also, crucially, black people who came from around the Atlantic world, so from West Africa, the Caribbean, sometimes from South America. So this group of black Americans were not necessarily all African Americans. Sometimes very hard to figure out whether or not they really are from the United States, because generally they will have told the clerks when they were booked in that they came from Virginia or New York. But it's all based on self-declaration. Nobody really knows. So again, if you'd escaped from slavery in Jamaica or Barbados or even South Carolina, would you tell the prison clerk that you were from South Carolina or from Jamaica? Probably not. So there is this kind of unreliability about the data, so some of this is guesswork. I think what we can say with confidence is that some of the black sailors who ended up in Dartmoor will have fled slavery by going to sea. Others will have been born into slavery but will have won their freedom before they were captured by the British. And still others will have been born free. So we have this kind of, various makeup here of black people in the prison from a lot of different places and potentially having different statuses in terms of their freedom or being enslaved, certainly at some point in their lives, and maybe even when they decided they would go to sea. Now, the story of black people at Dartmoor took an incredible twist in the autumn of 1813. And I want to say just a minute or two about this because it's so important. But again, I'm going to blow through it and carry on talking about other things. But just let me kind of mark your card with this. Okay, the total number of US prisoners in the autumn of 1813. So this is when it's still a French prison, Dartmoor. So there's not that many Americans there. There's about 520, 530. And about 70 of those are black. At least we think they are from the Register. Well, what happens? Well, that October, so October 1813, a group of white American prisoners petitioned the British authorities at Dartmoor to separate black and white sailors from each other. The British agreed, and soon afterwards, Dartmoor became the first segregated prison in American history. It's kind of incredible. How could this happen? Well, we have a reason for it given by one white sailor in a memoir he rushed into print when he got back to the United States in 1815. So this is what one white sailor that I know from the register, he was actually there at this time. Here's what he said. It was impossible to prevent these fellows, black people in the prison, from stealing, although they were seized up and flogged almost every day. So the white prisoner claimed that the black prisoners were criminals, in effect, that they were more prone to stealing than other prisoners. But in truth, I think something else very important was going on. At sea, black and white sailors have both been subjected to the iron discipline of their captains. So if you were black or white on a ship, you would effectively be equally under the complete sovereignty and authority of your captain. But in the British prison system, when ships were captured, the captains were separated from their crew. So actually, it's really interesting. The captains were taken off to quite cushy surroundings, relatively speaking, a kind of house arrest in nearby villages. So while all of our subjects here, the prisoners in Dartmoor, are toughing out in these horrific prison blocks with, wide open windows, freezing themselves and getting terrible diseases and fighting each other and whatever, while all that's going on, if you're a captain, you're actually in quite a nice village somewhere on the edge of Dartmoor, making friends with the locals, and you're separated from your crew. So the kinds of discipline and the kinds of politics on board ships suddenly disappear. So rather than having a situation in which you would get the captain giving black and white sailors directions and orders, you suddenly had this power vacuum among ordinary sailors. Now, rather than agreeing to share power with those black prisoners, particularly when it came to things like adjudicating who might have stolen something or just trying to keep order amongst themselves in the prison, white prisoners preferred, in fact demanded, that they be segregated from the black prisoners. So in effect, I think this wasn't about stealing, or rather, it wasn't about black people stealing. It was about white people suddenly desiring to exercise power in a monopoly, in a racial monopoly. So to do it in a way that meant that black sailors would not be equal with them politically. And I could get into this in more length, but I think it's so interesting to think about black and white sailors at sea being kind of equally under the authority of a captain. But suddenly, when they get on land in a prison, not having that captain, the problem becomes really sharp and acute. You need a politics. Can black and white sailors build a politics which dissolves the color line between them? Or will they insist, the white sailors, who again, we're way in the majority here, that they're going to exclude black people from political power? And that's what happened, exclusion. Now, in the short term, this meant that white Americans took over one of the three floors, the middle floor of prison 4, and the black prisoners were left at the top of the building, just to remind you again. So this is literally this is a photo of the actual space where that little black community began to develop in 1813 and 1814. But in the summer of 1814, after the French had been released, black prisoners took over all 3 floors of prison 4, and 4 became one of the biggest self-governing black communities outside of Africa and the Caribbean. But here's the funny part. Despite the fact that white sailors had demanded to be separated from black sailors, the two groups continued to associate with each other. And I'm just going to try and explain why there wasn't kind of complete segregation. Maybe I can get to that by giving you a sense very briefly of what prison life was like. So Dartmoor was super bleak, incredibly bleak. But it was also a place of incredible invention. Now, the British authorities knew that they were holding prisoners of war, not criminals. So the regime was not quite as harsh or maybe as directed as it would be if you were in a criminal prison. The captors had a measure of autonomy. And let me give you some examples. Prisoners were paid a small allowance each month. They were given access to a market, which met here in the middle of the prison. So where these soldiers are lined up here in this picture of the massacre. So they got to go to a market every morning. Local people from the neighboring villages would travel miles every day to sell food, to sell tobacco, soap, a huge range of other things, hats and clothing, books, playing cards. Apparently they also sold theatrical scenery. Again, I can get into that if you're interested. But crazy, roulette wheels, something else that got sold there. The prisoners bought all this stuff with this allowance money they had, but they also set up schools to teach each other navigation, maths, languages. They established a boxing gym and a fencing school, and they put on theatrical productions into theatres, one of them on the top floor of Prison 5 and the other in Prison 4. They also made things. So they found bones that they brought from the kitchens and they just carved them. So you can see a pretty good sense here of how Americans and French express themselves artistically in the era. On the left-hand side is an American carved ship. So an American prisoner of war made this amazing bone ship. And on the right-hand side, the French prisoners have made a guillotine. Okay, I haven't said much today about the sources of what we know about Dartmoor, but this is a good place for me to mention something really important as I'm talking a bit about the black prison and prison life more generally. The register, which I showed you, gives us the names of those 1,000 or so sailors of colour who ended up in Dartmoor. It gives us their birthplaces, their dates of birth, the ships they came in on, and so on. But of the 24 or so substantive accounts of Dartmoor we have, so people who wrote letters or newspaper articles or essays for the magazines, or even kind of wrote about Dartmoor in their memoirs, every single one of those accounts is by a white person. And many of the published accounts play up the idea that Prison 4, the black prison as they called it, was a place apart from the rest of the prison. It was supposedly controlled by a huge man who was known as King Dick, he's the guy in the chair here, who stood nearly 7 feet tall and kept the black prisoners in line with a huge club. This is an image from 1884, when the story has been kind of thoroughly racialized with the prejudices of that moment. Now, these published accounts, which talk about King Dick, the guy with the big club, being a tyrant and ruling over the black people there with this kind of iron regime, they tell us that the white prisoners mostly stayed away from Prison 4. But this is where the evidence becomes really interesting. So I've been telling you about Frank Palmer, right? And I've told you that he wrote in his journal on a daily basis about what was going on to him when he was in captivity. Well, Frank's journal does not corroborate the idea that white people avoided Prison 4, that the segregation politically amounted also to segregation that was social, a segregation of entertainment and kind of everyday life. In fact, it's clear from Frank's journal that he was in Prison 4 all the time. He was a regular at the church services held by this guy on the right, Simon Harris, a black Baptist preacher from Virginia. He also enjoyed going to the theater on the top of 4. In fact, he even tells us about one evening where he went to the theater in 4, saw 2 plays. Obviously, the turnkeys downstairs had already locked the door, so they had like a lock-in. They just spent the whole night drinking and dancing, black and white sailors together. And then when the turnkeys opened the door next morning, the white sailors left again. These kind of hidden stories break away from the published accounts, which claim that there was a kind of neatness to segregation at Dartmoor, and they reveal that there was actually a lively social life, which is not to say that there was no prejudice or that there weren't forms of white supremacy in the prison. It is to say that the act of being together in this prison, even when they were in separate blocks, didn't actually keep black and white sailors apart. They mingled plenty. What emerges is a world of lively interaction and camaraderie across the colour line, a world in which boundaries were regularly crossed, a world where Dartmoor's white chroniclers, the people that wrote about their experiences later on, came to feel that they had to wipe this stuff away. They had to try and sort of shuffle it under the carpet rather than confess to what had actually happened there. So, I've been trying to persuade you that Dartmoor was a place of invention and excitement, sometimes even joy, but we're getting into the home straight here. The prisoners found it hard to outrun their boredom and despair. In the winter of 1814 to 15, they were demoralized when the British discovered the 3 tunnels they had started to dig out of 3 of the prison blocks. They were hoping to go under the walls. When those tunnels were discovered, there was also a rash of paranoia and anxiety and infighting among the Americans as the prisoners tried to think about who may have betrayed the scheme, who gave it away. So this is a really bleak moment. That winter of 1814, 1815 also brought a new wave of respiratory viruses which hit the prisoners suddenly and often fatally. More than 200 American prisoners died in the hospital of the prison that winter, mostly of viral pneumonia. And then, of course, there's the agonizing hope of release. The War of 1812 hadn't been going all that well for the US. You guys, again, will recall that in the summer, in August of 1814, the Brits managed to burn the White House. They very nearly captured Baltimore. They sacked Washington. But at the same time, after those kind of terrible, that nadir of the war for the United States, its fortunes began to improve on the battlefield, and peace talks were ongoing in Belgium. And this is the terrible part for the prisoners. They knew that American negotiators and British negotiators were talking to each other in Belgium. The rumors that those talks were going well or that they were going badly created this kind of terrible cycle in which the hopes of release were raised and dashed and then raised again. And Frank Palmer wrote about this in his journal on Christmas Day of 1814. "Hope deferred," he said, "is like a lingering consumption. It wastes away our lives by degrees and will end only in death." So it's not a very good talk for our times. Then, let's go upbeat. News reaches the prison on the 29th of December, 1814, that an agreement has been signed between the British and the American negotiators in Brussels. Hooray. The 5,500 American prisoners who are stuck in Dartmoor celebrate wildly, look forward to their release. But then the prison authorities remind them that they have to wait for the treaty to be ratified. And that means it needs to go all the way to Washington, get approved by Congress, and then a ship has to come all the way back saying it's been ratified by Congress in Washington. That took more than 2 months. And again, one of the tragedies here is that during the wait, another 100 or so prisoners die of pneumonia in the prison hospital. The mood at Dartmoor became bleaker than it had ever been, even though the end of the war seemed tantalizingly close. And here's where things get really grim. In early March, the signed peace agreement has been returned from the United States to Britain, but the British and American governments agreed that the Dartmoor prisoners should stay locked up in Dartmoor, even though the war was over, until transport could be arranged. Now, this caused another round of huge delays as the US representative in London struggled to hire captains and ships to bring back, what was basically a small town across the Atlantic from Dartmoor to the US. So even when the ratified peace agreement had arrived, you were still stuck in Dartmoor and you weren't able to leave. So tensions were bubbling and simmering, and on the 6th of April, 1815, Dartmoor finally exploded. The sailors were desperate to get out. They were indignant at being held in custody when peace had already been agreed. They were haunted by the thought that they might still die in Dartmoor. They might catch pneumonia, even though they ought to be able to walk free. Now, they didn't think they should escape. They didn't think they'd be crazy enough to kind of break out en masse. But the idea they might escape absolutely peopled the kind of minds of the militia guards who were actually trying to keep order in the prison, so the British guards in Dartmoor. On the afternoon of the 6th of April, a group of bored prisoners began taunting the guards by digging a hole through an internal wall of the prison. The guards responded by kind of jabbing their bayonets through this hole in the wall. And then another group of prisoners marched into the center of the prison, so the marketplace here right in the middle, and they forced open the gates. And they didn't do this to escape because it would be madness for them to think that they could get all the way to Plymouth. They did it because they were desperate. But the soldiers, thanks to an incredibly bad piece of luck, which is the fact that the bread wagons with the next day's bread ration were at that moment coming through the doors of the prison. So actually all of the doors of the prison were open when the Americans broke through the gates. This freaked out the soldiers, and the soldiers started to fire. This is very grim. Here's the moment in one of the images captured after the event when the firing begins. You can see the soldiers there lined up, all firing at the Americans. The shooting actually lasted for more than an hour because what happened was, once the Americans had been forced back from the market, the British guards followed them into the yards and continued shooting. Frank Palmer and the other prisoners had a pretty low estimate of the British, but they still couldn't believe what they'd seen. It was definitely a war crime. There was no other way around it. The British knew they were in trouble. They immediately convened an investigation led by two admirals who came up from Plymouth, and the British government knew that it would need to do a fuller inquiry and try and bring the Americans on board. But here's where the whole thing gets very unfortunate. As it happened, two big American politicians had recently come to London to talk to the British about something else. Those two politicians were Albert Gallatin, who had been the Treasury Secretary under Thomas Jefferson, and Henry Clay, very famous American politician, then a congressman from Kentucky. They were in London to negotiate a trade deal with Britain. They were not in London to form part of an inquiry into a massacre that might reopen the war. So when the British government asked them if they wanted to join the inquiry, they both said, "No, it's fine, we're not going to do it. We want to stay here and talk about trade." Instead, they sent a callow young guy called Charles King, who was just an American businessman who happened to be in London. His father had been the US ambassador to London before, so he was kind of quite well known. And this young man, King, went to Dartmoor with a very wily and experienced British military lawyer who persuaded Charles King that actually the whole thing had been super unfortunate. It had been a terrible event. You know, really lessons must be learned. But actually, no crime had been committed. And Charles King, on behalf of the United States, signed off on that verdict. Now, at this point, the Americans are being evacuated. So finally, the ships have shown up and they're beginning to be brought back across the Atlantic. It'll take more than 3 months for all of them to move. But as soon as the Americans get back to the US, you begin getting eyewitness accounts of the massacre published in American papers. When the American veterans arrive back in the US, they don't get any support from their government, so they're wearing their rags from the prison. Many of them have to walk home dozens of miles from the ports where they end up. Politicians in New York and other port towns send these alarm letters to James Madison, the president, saying, "You must make sure that you look after these guys because the public are very upset about what's going on, and the public will not stand for the treatment of these Dartmoor prisoners." But Madison made the cold calculation that reopening the Dartmoor affair might threaten the trade deal with Britain. He was confident that the public sympathy in the US with the Dartmoor veterans would be short-lived. And he was right. Many of the returning Dartmoor prisoners tried to talk to their local representatives to see if they could reopen the inquiry, to try and get justice, but they didn't have the resources to campaign, and they were sailors. So they did what sailors do. They went back to sea. They kind of left the political field of battle, and their campaign was over almost before it began. Our hero, Frank Palmer, got a couple of his journal entries into a New York newspaper, but then he also went and sailed back into the Atlantic. Frank spent most of the next 8 years away from the United States, sailing the world because he had to make a living, rather than fighting for compensation for the ordeal he'd suffered at Dartmoor. He died aged just 31 in 1824. His journal was sold to a collector and finally ended up in the New York Public Library, which is where it is today. As I mentioned at the start of the lecture, Palmer had been sure that his fellow Americans would always remember Dartmoor. But it proved incredibly hard to fit the massacre and the prison into a kind of usable or popular vision of the American past. Sailors didn't have the cultural or the political capital to reopen the inquiry. In fact, they couldn't even get pensions. And they were still petitioning the federal government for pensions after the Civil War, so in the late 1860s. Now, black veterans of Dartmoor would often invoke their sacrifices in the prison during speeches and political meetings to try to claim citizenship or more of the rights of citizenship in the US in the 1830s and the 1840s. But again, what they had done for their country formed just a kind of blip in this moment because Dartmoor itself had already kind of sunk beneath the waves in the American memory. And there's one last thing. In terms of being kind of orphaned by history, this whole event. The War of 1812 was the last time that Britain and the United States would go to war. The victims of the Dartmoor Massacre were the last men to be killed in a conflict between the two powers, and that really matters to the forgetting of Dartmoor. We cry for vengeance, Frank Palmer had written on the night of April the 6th, 1815. But as things turned out, the desperate prisoners were condemned to a final misfortune. Their story was an inconvenience to the new friendship between Britain and the United States, and the incredible events of Dartmoor Prison were largely forgotten. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Sorry that went on so long. Okay, we do have a little bit of time if anyone has any questions that they want to ask. Let's see here. So right now, I'm not seeing any questions in my question bar. Let me see. Okay, I'll just try and bring this up live here. Let's have a look. Am I missing anything? Can you see any over there, Nikki? Oh, you found some? Awesome. Okay, bear with us here, everyone. Yeah, they weren't appearing on the pad here. I'm going to get some assistance to see if I can find the questions. Hi. I'm so sorry, it wasn't on it, didn't show up. Oh, thank you so much, Mark. Oh my goodness. Whoa. Okay, this is awesome. Okay. Great, guys. Okay. All right, lots of comments about how someone has written that the weather in Dartmoor is still bad. That's true, as a historical fact and an actual one. I actually got in trouble with somebody who's written about Dartmoor for suggesting that the weather is always terrible there. And I have been thinking a bit about the kind of tourism board, commercial possibilities of this project, and about the fact that I spend a lot of my time suggesting that Dartmoor is not a place that you would want to go, which is not true. It's beautiful, but in the winter it can be quite bleak. Okay, someone has asked, Vic Blickham, thank you for watching. Were any Americans captured on US soil and brought to the UK as prisoners, or was it only sailors? Yeah, there were a number of Americans who were captured, so people who were fighting the land campaigns in Canada who were captured, but they tended to be held in Canada, and particularly since they were in militia and in the US Army, they were actually prioritized for release before these privateersmen. So actually, if you think about these ordinary sailors, they were like at the bottom of the heap when it came to prisoner exchanges. So yeah, there were thousands of prisoners who were taken on land, as it were, but the majority of them didn't end up in British prisons. You had to do something kind of really bad to end up being transferred. So, you had to be involved in some kind of trouble in a prison or whatever in Canada to end up being moved over. Okay. Let's see if I can find some more. Do you have them over there, Nikki? Unfortunately, my phone is locked, or rather, Mark's phone is locked. I'm so sorry about these technical issues. It's basically my fault that this has happened. Do you have any more you want to throw, or shall I just wrap up? This is why it's so important for all of you guys to be here in person. This whole experience doesn't work without you. Even though we try and make it work, it doesn't work properly without you. Okay, let me just see if I can find any more here. Okay. Okay. Oh, my wife has sent me a link. Oh, that's very kind. Okay, let's just do a few more because I went on for way too long. So, why did Britain go to the expense of bringing prisoners of war to England? Why not keep them in Bermuda, the Caribbean, or Canada? Okay, that's a great question. Thank you, Christopher Brealey. One of the reasons Britain ended up bringing people back to Britain is that actually these land prisons in Britain are cheaper to run than all of those prisons in other places. So if you think about it for a second, if you've got a prison in Barbados or Bermuda or somewhere else, actually just getting the supplies, even basic stuff like drinking water, to that prison is a real challenge. It's not an easy thing to do at all. Whereas if you can just get the human beings, stuff them all in a ship and send them back across the Atlantic, once they get into the system at home, all the supply lines are much shorter. So actually, although it seems counterintuitive, it was a lot cheaper for those guys to end up being kept in Britain. Okay, Were there any initiatives after the peace treaty to release the black prisoners to be free residents of England rather than to return them to the US as possible slaves? Susan Poland, thank you very much for that question. Yeah, the fate of the black sailors is so interesting, partly because we think some of them probably did end up melting away into British ports. Some of them may even have signed up for British ships rather than go back to the US. But there is a fascinating story I tell in the book of one prisoner in particular who was very nervous that they would be placed on one of these evacuation vessels in the summer of 1815 and that they would be sent back to the American South. And this is someone that was very nervous about being in a southern port, as many black sailors were, because at that moment, in those southern ports, places like Charleston, you could end up as a black person. If you couldn't post a bond or if you were accused of something, you would end up in the city jail. You could easily be sold into slavery. And in fact, one guy is sold into slavery, a guy from Rhode Island, and ends up being in a kind of 12 years a slave style situation. So a free African-American, held at Dartmoor, taken on a ship back to South Carolina, then suddenly effectively press-ganged, as it were, or kind of clubbed by these slavers and taken to Georgia. And he is released by a Georgia judge in 1819, having finally found friends in the North who've come down and said, this guy has been illegally enslaved. So the last Dartmoor prisoner to be freed is this guy who was freed in 1819, not from Dartmoor, but from a plantation in Georgia. So actually the fate of the black sailors after what happened to them at Dartmoor is fascinating, and their ordeal is absolutely not over. Okay, let's do one more because nobody should really be online for more than an hour these days. Okay, Davis Goodman, thank you for this. How did you come to write about this? This is a great question, which I like answering because, you know, there's a sort of sense that as a historian, there's this kind of grand design and that your projects are a reflection of your kind of creativity or your sort of genius or whatever else. Literally, I went on holiday to Devon and I kind of drove my poor family onto Dartmoor and like drove into the prison. More or less actually drove into the prison. And there's an amazing, finally, there's an amazing plaque outside which lists the names of all these American service people who died there, and also the privateersmen. And I just thought, wow, this is a story about American history here in Britain that I know absolutely nothing about. So I kind of felt like a total ignoramus. But also it got me thinking a bit about how these early moments of tension between Britain and the United States, in this period kind of after the American Revolution, because we developed this special relationship or the kind of Anglo-American thing, and we became kind of fast friends and kind of co-conspirators almost in things like the settling of the West and the development of American business and so on. It's like this kind of these early pages of US-British relations, you know, they got turned over. And then there was a weight placed on them and they were harder to see. So for me, as a Brit who does American history, the fact that I kind of bumped into the prison and found this story that way was serendipitous. So it felt like a story I had to tell. Okay, I'm so sorry to have tested your patience, particularly with the problems we've had on the technical side, which I'll claim full responsibility over. Thank you so much for watching, for tuning in. I know this must feel weird and disembodied for all of you, but we really, really appreciate your continuing engagement, both with Jesus College and with the University of Cambridge. And we hope very much that you'll come to other events in the Alumni Festival and that you'll come back to see us, crucially, when that becomes a thing again. So thank you for giving your time to this afternoon. It's been a lot of fun for me. And yeah, thanks and have a good weekend. Thank you, everyone.